The restaurant was called Yunhe, Galaxy in English, and it sat on the 47th floor of the Latte World Tower like God had personally reserved it for people who had no business being ordinary. Everything about Yunhe whispered money. The lighting was gold and amber, the kind that made every woman look like a painting and every man look like he had answers. The menu had no prices because if you were asking, you were in the wrong building. The waitstaff moved like shadows, present when needed, invisible when not. Laureen Adiz sat across from Kwon Seo-jun looking like she had been sent specifically to ruin every other woman in that restaurant's evening. She was wearing a deep burgundy wrap dress that moved with her like it had studied her body language for years. Her locks pinned up in a sculptural updo with two loose ones framing her face like punctuation marks. Her jewelry was minimal gold, clean, intentional. She smelled like oud and something warm that Seo-jun had not been able to name since the first time she walked into a meeting room 3 months ago, and made him forget he'd been running a criminal empire since he was 22. "You're staring again," Laureen said without looking up from her menu. "I'm admiring," Seo-jun corrected, swirling his wine. "Admiring is staring with better PR." She finally looked up. Her eyes were doing the thing, that half-amused, fully in charge thing that made him feel like the most powerful man in Seoul and a complete fool at the same time. "Order your food, Seo-jun. I'm hungry." Kwon Seo-jun was not a man people spoke to like that. He was 31, the head of the Kwon Syndicate, which controlled significant portions of Seoul's real estate underbelly, private security contracts, and imports that nobody asked too many questions about. He had a jaw that sculptors would cry over and the kind of quiet authority that made rooms rearrange themselves around him. He wore a black-fitted suit that evening with no tie, top button open, and he looked, in the words of his own mother, unreasonably fine for someone I pushed out of my body. And yet here he was, being gently scolded about staring by a woman who was simultaneously reading a menu and dismantling his entire emotional infrastructure. He loved it. He loved her. He had known it for exactly 6 weeks and 3 days, and he had not yet said it out loud because Laureen had a particular skill for making grand feelings feel silly if they weren't delivered correctly. He was waiting for the right moment. The right moment, unfortunately, was about to be hijacked. They were mid-appetizer, a delicate truffle and wagyu situation that Laureen was describing with the reverence of someone who genuinely understood both engineering precision and sensory pleasure, when the temperature in the restaurant shifted. It wasn't loud. That was the thing about Cha Yejin. She understood that the most devastating entrances weren't the noisy ones. She had learned that from her father, Cha Min-soo, who was the sitting president of South Korea and a man who had never once raised his voice because he never had to. Yejin had inherited his understanding of power, weaponized it with her looks, and used it her whole life like a scalpel. She was 29, legendarily beautiful, and wearing a red dress so short it was practically a statement of intent. Her hair was straight and perfect, her makeup was the kind that took 2 hours to look effortless, and she walked into Yunhe like she owned the deed. Several phones came out. Seoul's gossip ecosystem ran on sightings like this. The ex-girlfriend of Kwon Seo-jun, the president's daughter, showing up at the most exclusive restaurant in the city on a Friday night. By morning, 12 blogs would have opinions. Seo-jun saw her first. Laureen, who had been gesturing with her fork to illustrate a point about structural load calculations somehow becoming a metaphor for emotional unavailability, noticed his face change. She turned around slowly. She took in Yejin, the red dress, the deliberate walk toward their table, the smile that was not a smile. Laureen put her fork down, picked up her wine, took a sip, set it down again. "Is that her?" she asked, voice completely level. Seojun's jaw was tight. "Laureen, Seo-jun." She said his name like a full stop. "Is that her?" "Yes." Laureen nodded slowly, the way engineers nod when they've identified the exact point of structural failure. "Okay." Yejin arrived at the table radiating performance. She ignored Laureen with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years making other women invisible through sheer force of dismissal. "Seo-jun, she said, her voice liquid and warm, placing both hands on his shoulders from behind and leaning down like she was whispering a secret to someone who still belonged to her. "I was so surprised to see you here. I've been thinking about you so much lately." "He looks well thought about," Laureen said pleasantly. Yejin blinked. She turned to Laureen for the first time, clocking the dress, the locks, the gold, the absolute composure, and recalibrating with the slightly confused expression of someone who had expected to find a puddle and found bedrock instead. "I'm sorry," Yejin said with a sweet smile. "I don't think we've met. I'm Cha Yejin." Pause, deliberate, seasoned, lethal. Seo-jun and I were together for 4 years. "Congratulations on surviving 4 years," Laureen said, her tone genuinely conversational. "I'm Laureen. We're on a date right now, so..." The "so" landed like a gavel. Yejin's smile stayed, but her eyes shifted. She had a script for this, the emotional appeal, the manufactured memory, the whispered thing about how nobody would ever know Seo-jun the way she did, the implication that whatever this new woman was, she was temporary. She'd run this script before. It had always worked. "I just wanted to say hello," Yejin continued, pivoting, turning back to Seo-jun. "Do you remember the last time we were here together? You ordered the..." "He remembers," Laureen interrupted gently. "People generally remember things that happened to them. What I'm curious about is why you're remembering it here. Tonight, while we're eating." She tilted her head. "Is the food not good on the other side of the restaurant?" A few tables nearby had gone very quiet. Yejin felt the ground shift slightly. This was not a puddle. This woman was speaking to her like she was a minor administrative inconvenience, and doing it in a tone so pleasant it couldn't even be called rude. That was somehow worse. "I just think," Yejin said, her voice dropping to something more intimate, more pointed, angling towards Seo-jun, "that you deserve to know the full picture before you." "Before he what?" Laureen asked. Her voice was still warm. That was the terrifying part. "Before he has dinner with a woman who actually respects his time? Before he enjoys a Friday without his phone blowing up at midnight?" She smiled. It was a beautiful smile. It was also a wall. "Because I know about the midnight calls, Yejin, and the texts, and the thing you told his cousin at the Apgujeong event last month." She picked up her wine again. "He told me. He tells me things. That's how relationships work when they're healthy." Seo-jun was looking at Laureen with an expression that was 1 part awe and 2 parts 1M going to marry this woman. Yejin's composure cracked, just slightly. "Just enough. You think you know him?" she said. And now there was an edge. The script abandoned, real irritation bleeding through. "You've known him for what? 5 minutes? I know everything about. You know the version of him that let you get away with things," Laureen said simply. "That version is retired. I don't know what to tell you." The restaurant was now fully, completely silent in their radius. 3 waiters had stopped moving. A man at the next table had put down his chopsticks. Yejin stared at her. Something mean and cornered moved across her face. "You're embarrassing yourself," she said quietly. "Do you know who my father is? Do you know what I could do to your..." She didn't finish the sentence, because Laureen stood up. She didn't stand up dramatically. She didn't knock anything over or raise her voice. She simply rose to her full height, which was considerable in heels, set her napkin on the table with the precision of a woman who had spent her career calculating tolerances and load-bearing limits, looked Cha Yejin directly in the eyes, and said, quietly, kindly, almost gently, "I know exactly who your father is, and I'm not afraid of him, his office, his connections, or the fact that he raised someone who crashes dinner dates in a dress that's trying too hard." She paused. "I'm going to ask you once to leave our table. And if I don't?" Yejin said. "A mistake. A real one." The slap was not telegraphed. There was no dramatic wind-up, no trembling hand, no movie-style slow motion. It was clean, swift, and precise, the same way Laureen approached every problem that needed a direct solution. The sound of it rang out across Yunha like a single clean note. Yejin stumbled back into a waiter who caught her by the arm, her hand flying to her cheek, her perfect composure completely irreparably gone. Her eyes were wide. Nobody had ever... "That was your one," Laureen said. She sat back down, picked up her fork. "Seo-jun, the wagyu is getting cold." Seo-jun stared at her for one long, beautiful, speechless second. Then he started laughing, quietly at first and then fully, helplessly, pressing his hand over his mouth and failing completely. His shoulders were shaking. Yejin fled. The red dress disappeared around the corner toward the elevators. Several people at nearby tables began cautiously applauding. A woman 3 tables over raised her glass. Loreen took a bite of Wagyu and pointed her fork at him. "Stop laughing and eat." "You're incredible," he said, still recovering. "I know. The food is very good. By the way, you chose well." By midnight, the story was on 6 different soul gossip forums. By morning, Loreen Adiz was, quietly and completely, a legend. The problem with slapping the president's daughter in a 5-star restaurant is that, eventually, the president finds out. Took 48 hours. Cha Min-soo was a measured man. He had run the country for 3 years on a platform of dignity, restraint, and strategic composure. He wore that composure like a second suit. He was also, underneath all of it, a father who had spoiled his only daughter into a monster and was either too deep in denial or too deep in love to see it. Either way, Yejin had never once been told no in a way that stuck. Not by schools, not by ex-boyfriends, not by the 6 women who had preceded Loreen in Seojun's orbit and had each quietly retreated under varying degrees of campaign. He called Seojun first. That conversation lasted 4 minutes and ended with Seojun saying, "With respect, sir, your daughter came to our table. She was asked to leave," and then hanging up, which was either the bravest or most reckless thing he'd done in his criminal career, and the threshold was genuinely high. Then Cha Min-soo's people started making calls. Loreen found out about the pressure campaign on a Tuesday from Kwan Myri, Seojun's mother, who had called her at 8:47 a.m. while Loreen was eating cereal and reviewing the structural specs for a high-rise project she was leading in Mapogu. "Lorena," Myri said without preamble, "the way women say names when they've decided to be on your side forever. That man's people have been calling Seojun's lawyers. They're saying you assaulted a public figure." Loreen ate a spoonful of cereal. She walked up to our dinner table. "I know that. I'm on your side. Keep up." Myri's voice was sharp and warm and absolutely her son's mother. She was 63, immaculately dressed at all times, ran 3 legitimate businesses as Seojun's front infrastructure, and had once, famously within the family, chased Cha Yejin out of her house with a silk Hermes scarf she had then refused to touch again, and donated to charity. "I'm calling because they're going to try to embarrass you publicly. Something about your work permits and your engineering credentials. Yejin's been talking." Loreen set her spoon down. "My credentials? Something about whether your qualifications transfer properly, that your projects should be reviewed, that there may be irregularities." Loreen's voice had gone very, very still. "She's coming for my work." A beat. Yes. This was a strategic miscalculation on Yejin's part. A catastrophic one. Because Loreen Adiz Mensa had many soft spots. She was bubbly. She laughed at everything. She made friends in elevators. She sent voice notes that were mostly just her cackling at something she'd seen on the street. But her work was not a soft spot. Her work was the thing she had built from nothing across 2 countries, in a field that had told her repeatedly and in many creative ways that she was not the demographic it was designed for. Her credentials were not a vulnerability. They were a fortress. "Okay," Loreen said. She was already opening her laptop. "Okay." Myri sounded slightly worried. "What does okay mean?" "It means okay, Myri SSI. Thank you for the heads up." A pause. "Tell Seojun not to do anything. I'll handle this." "He's going to want to. Tell him I said to sit down." There was a sound from Myri's end that Loreen would later describe to her best friend as the specific laugh of a woman who has waited years to watch someone put her son in his place and is now fully living. Loreen's credentials were not questionable. She had a bachelor's in civil engineering from the University of Lagos, a master's from Imperial College London, and a research fellowship from KAIST Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, which was how she'd ended up in Seoul in the first place. She was licensed in 3 jurisdictions. She had led projects in Nigeria, the UK, and now Korea. She had a paper published in a peer-reviewed structural engineering journal about seismic load distribution in asymmetrical high-rises that had been cited 47 times. She was also, by some coincidence that the universe had arranged with excellent taste, personal friends with Professor Yoon Chang-ho, one of the most respected civil engineers in Korea, former dean of engineering at Seoul National University, and a man who, when Loreen sent him a very calm, very specific message about what was happening, responded in 11 minutes with, "This is absurd. I'll make some calls. Also, you should come to my wife's birthday dinner. She loved the bottle you sent." She was also, as Seoul's construction and architecture community had discovered over 18 months. The engineer who had flagged a drainage design flaw in a Gangnam development project that would have caused significant flooding within 5 years. She'd caught it during a third-party review nobody had asked her to do. She'd quietly reported it had been quietly fixed, and the developers had quietly never forgotten it. Seoul's engineering world was small. It had opinions. And when word got out carefully through channels the way Laureen had learned to let information travel when she needed it to go somewhere specific, the opinions were loud. 3 senior engineers issued a joint statement through the Korean Society of Civil Engineers affirming her credentials. A construction conglomerate she'd consulted for posted a quote on their corporate LinkedIn about the quality of her work that got 14,000 likes in 6 hours. The KIST Fellowship Office confirmed her research record publicly. A journalist at the Jungong Ilbo who had been trying to get Laureen to give an interview for 4 months suddenly found herself with a very good story about a foreign engineer being targeted for harassment by politically connected figures, and wrote it. She did not name Cha Yejin directly. She didn't have to. Seoul knew how to read. Between lines, Cha Min-soo, to his credit, tried once more. His chief of staff called a number connected to Laureen's firm with vague language about mutual benefit and settling misunderstandings quietly. The person who received the call was Laureen's project manager, Bae Hyunki, who was 26, extremely loyal, and who immediately forwarded the recording to Laureen with the message, "Nuna, do you want me to post this?" Laureen replied, "Not yet, baby boy, save it." Through all of this, Seo Jun was doing the hardest thing he had ever done in 31 years of being a man who ran an illegal empire. He was sitting down. He was sitting down because Laureen had told him to. He was sitting down because his mother, who agreed with Laureen on everything now and had essentially adopted her telepathically, had also told him to. He was sitting down because he had watched Laureen work and understood, finally and completely, that she was more dangerous than him in every arena that didn't involve a weapon. But he was not idle. He made one call. One quiet, professional call to someone whose name would never appear in this story. And whatever Cha Min-soo's people had been planning in terms of further legal maneuvering quietly ran into a series of procedural obstacles that nobody could explain. Seo Jun didn't mention this to Laureen. She didn't ask. They had an understanding that was still forming its own language. What he did do, openly and completely, was show up at her apartment on the Wednesday evening with her favorite jampong from the place in Sinchon she'd mentioned once in passing 3 weeks ago. A bottle of wine that cost more than his first car, and absolutely no agenda. She opened the door in an oversized hoodie, locks down, reading glasses on, highlighter in her hand. "How did you know my order?" she said. "I listened to you," he said simply. She stared at him for a second. Then she stepped back and let him in. They ate on her couch with her structural drawings spread across the coffee table and a Korean drama on low volume that neither of them watched. He asked questions about her project. Real ones, not polite ones, and she explained things with her hands the way she always did when she was excited, and at some point his arm had found its way around her shoulders without either of them marking the moment it happened. "You didn't have to stay back," she said, during a quiet moment. "I know you wanted to do something." "I did something," he said. "Yeah, I stayed back. That's the thing I wanted to do most." He paused. "You didn't need me to fight for you." "No," she agreed. "But it's nice that you wanted to." He pressed his lips to her temple. She pretended to look at her drawings for another 4 seconds and then gave up and leaned into him. And the city of Seoul glittered outside her window, 23 stories down, completely unbothered. Myri, who had been texting Laureen at intervals to provide real-time intelligence and general encouragement, sent a message at 10:14 p.m. that said, "Is my son there?" Laureen replied, "Yes." Myri, "Good. Make him clean something. He needs to feel useful." Laureen looked up at Seo Jun, who was relaxed and warm and doing that thing where he looked at her like she was a problem he was delighted to never solve. "Your mother says you should clean something." He looked around her apartment. "It's already clean. Then you're welcome to do the dishes from dinner." He got up without a word of complaint. From the kitchen, a moment later, she heard him turn on the tap and start humming something low and tuneless. Laureen went back to her drawings, smiling at the paper. The thing about Kwan Myri was that people consistently and fatally underestimated her because she was elegant. She was the kind of woman who wore her age like an investment. Every year of it deliberate, well-maintained, intentional. She smelled like Chanel No. 5 and operated with the precision of a woman who had run logistics for a criminal organization without ever holding a title, a weapon, or a traceable bank account in her own name. She was charming at charity galas. She was warm at church. She had buried 2 enemies using nothing but information and patience and had never once raised her voice. When she decided to love someone, she did it the way she did everything else. Completely, strategically, and with escalating commitment. She had decided to love Laureen somewhere around the 3rd week of June, bringing her name up in conversation more than 3 times per phone call. By the time the Yunha dinner happened and Myri heard the second-hand account from her nephew who'd been at the restaurant, she had moved from love to ride-or-die allegiance. By the time Cha Minsu's people came after Laureen's credentials, Myri had entered a state of focused, elegant warfare that she found genuinely rejuvenating. She was 63 and she had been bored. The public confrontation, the real one, the one that ended things, happened on a Saturday afternoon at the COEX atrium in Gangnam, which was unfortunate for Cha Yejin because the COEX atrium was large, public, glass-ceilinged, and extremely well documented by the collective phone cameras of a Saturday shopping crowd. It was not planned. That was the thing. Laureen was there because she'd agreed to meet her friend and colleague Grace, another black woman in engineering, Ghanaian, working at a different firm, who was the closest thing Laureen had to a fellow soldier in Seoul, for lunch and then a very specific mission involving finding a lamp. Myri was there because she had a standing Saturday routine that involved the COEX bookstore and a particular brand of hand cream only sold there. They had, by a coincidence arranged entirely by the universe and partially by Myri, who had seen Laureen's Instagram story and realized they were in the same building, ended up at the same cafe. Yejin was there because she had been tracking Seojin's location through methods that were legally ambiguous and had seen him drop Laureen off in Gangnam that morning. She arrived with 2 friends, Shin Hyejin and Oh Soo-min, who were beautiful and loyal and deeply unequipped for what was about to happen. She spotted Laureen at a cafe table with Grace and an older woman she didn't immediately recognize, wearing a cream silk blouse, pearls, and reading glasses, looking at a menu like she was reviewing a business proposal. Yejin had decided, in the 48 hours since the engineering story had run, that the problem was she hadn't been direct enough, that she'd been too subtle, that what was needed was a genuine, public, emotional confrontation that would make Laureen look aggressive and unstable, that would remind Seoul who the Cha family was, and that would finally, definitively, end this. She walked to the table. Her friends flanked her. It was supposed to look powerful. "We need to talk," she said to Laureen. No greeting. Full voltage. Laureen looked up from her iced tea. Grace, who Laureen had fully briefed on the entire situation in the manner of a crisis debrief, leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had bought a front-row ticket. The older woman set down her menu. Yejin finally looked at her and realized, with a lurching, horrible recognition, who she was looking at. "Yejin," said Kwan Myri pleasantly. "It's been some time." The last time they had been in the same space, Myri had been chasing Yejin across a garden in Hanamdong with a Hermes scarf and extremely specific opinions about Yejin's character. Yejin had blocked the memory as an act of psychological self-preservation. "I wasn't," Yejin started. "Talking to me? No. You were talking to my future daughter-in-law." Myri folded her hands on the table. It was a small gesture. It landed like a gavel. "So you're talking to me? Future daughter-in-law?" Laureen said, eyebrows climbing. "Hush, we'll discuss timeline later." Myri did not look at Laureen when she said this. She was looking at Yejin with the focused patience of a woman who had been waiting for this specific moment for a long time and had no intention of rushing it. "What was it you came to say?" Yejin's friends had taken a small, involuntary step backward. This was not the terrain they'd signed up for. "This is between me and," Yejin tried. "It is not," Myri said simply. "It stopped being just between you and Seojun when you came to their dinner. It stopped being between you and her when your father's office made calls about her professional credentials." The pleasantness in Myri's voice had not wavered. That was the part that was frightening. "I know your father, Yejin SSI. I've known him for 15 years. He is a man of institutional power. I am a woman of personal power. Those are different things, and I think at some level he understands that." "Are you threatening the president?" Yejin's voice had gone strange. "I'm explaining a situation," Myri said. "There's no threat needed. What I'm telling you is that what you have been doing to my son, and now to Laureen, is finished. Not because of any single thing I'll do, but because Soul is tired of you, baby. And tired people talk. At that moment, Grace, who had been admirably silent, reached across and touched Laureen's arm. Is she always like this? She whispered. I'm getting to know her myself, Laureen whispered back. Yejin had gone pale. Not from the words alone. She had been in rooms with powerful people her whole life and had learned to absorb words. She was pale because she had looked around and noticed, for the first time, that 5 or 6 nearby tables had people on their phones. Not subtly. One woman was openly pointing her camera. A young man in a bucket hat had clearly been recording for at least a minute. Soul liked to gossip, but Soul also liked a moment when the record needed to be set straight. I love Seo Jun, Yejin said, and for the first and only time in this entire saga, her voice cracked. It was real. Laureen heard it and noted it without celebration. Yejin's feelings were real. That didn't make her actions acceptable, but the feelings were real. Laureen set down her drink. I believe you, she said quietly, but the way you love him was making him miserable. And the way you've come after me is not love for him. It's control for yourself. She met Yejin's eyes evenly. You should talk to someone. Genuinely. Not because I'm being mean. Because you're clearly hurting and you're taking it out on everyone around you and your father has let you do it so long that you don't know how to stop. The table was very quiet. Grace looked at Laureen with the expression of someone witnessing a person who has genuinely done the inner work. Myri looked at Laureen with the expression of someone selecting a wedding venue in her mind. Yejin stood there, chin raised, something complicated and wounded moving through her. Her 2 friends were now definitely standing apart from her, one of them looking at the floor. She left. No finale. No last word. She walked out of the Suyex atrium with her remaining dignity in one hand and a lot to think about in the other. Cha Min-soo made one more move. He was his daughter's father, and so he tried. He requested a meeting with Laureen through an intermediary. A neutral location, a private room at a hotel in Uedo. Laureen showed up with one person, Bae Hyunki, her project manager, who she brought everywhere and who was recording from his jacket pocket out of general principle. The president was not there in person. His deputy chief of staff was a man named Jung Byung-go, 50s, excellent suit, practiced in the art of the reasonable-sounding unreasonable ask. He suggested, in very smooth language, that perhaps Laureen might consider stepping back from the public conversation around the engineering story. That perhaps a quieter profile might serve her well professionally. That the administration valued talented foreign professionals and hoped she understood the importance of good relationships with the government. Laureen listened to all of it. She had brought a thermos of tea, and she sipped from it during the meeting in a way that Jung Byung-go found deeply unnerving but couldn't explain. When he finished, she said, I have a recording of the call your office made to my firm about my credentials. I have not published it. I have no plans to publish it, as long as this conversation we're having right now is the last one. She capped her thermos. I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in doing my work and living my life. If those 2 things are allowed to continue without interference, everyone here goes home happy. She stood up. Please tell President Cha I understand he loves his daughter. I'd suggest he try to help her instead of protect her from consequences. The distinction matters. She walked out. Hyunki followed, nearly tripping over his own feet with the effort of not reacting until they got to the elevator. In the elevator, Nuna, save it for outside. Outside. Laureen stood on the Uedo sidewalk, Taa River in the distance, October wind doing something cinematic with her locks, and she called Seo Jun. He picked up on the second ring. How did it go? It went. She squinted into the sun. We're done with that chapter. Pause. Are you okay? I'm extremely okay. She started walking. I want Jajangmyeon for dinner. Not the delivery place, the one in Mapo that your mother introduced me to. I'll book it. And tell your mother I said she was very good today. She could hear him smiling. She's gonna print that out and frame it. She absolutely should. Laureen turned a corner. The city opening up wide and glittering and fully, unapologetically hers. Seo Jun. Yeah. I like you a lot. A beat. A very specific kind of quiet. I love you, he said. Not performed. Not strategic. Just true the way facts were true. She walked half a block before she answered. I know, she said. That's it? I know. I love you too. Kwon Seo-jun. Now stop fishing and make the reservation. He laughed. The full one, the helpless one, the one only she got. And she smiled at the sidewalk and kept walking, and Seoul sparkled around her like it knew exactly what it was hosting. The dinner at Mapo was long and loud. Myri came because she was Myri and nobody had told her not to. Grace came because Loreen invited her. Hyunki came because Seo-jun had said bring the kid, he deserves it. Two of Seo-jun's closest men, Nam Ji-hoon and Park Sun-woo, arrived at some point and the table that had been booked for 4 became a table for 7 and the restaurant's owner, who knew Myri personally, simply moved them to the back room and brought extra banchan. Myri, 3 glasses of Macchiali in, told the complete and unabridged story of the garden incident with the Hermes scarf. Seo-jun tried to stop her. She told him to sit down. He sat down. Loreen laughed until she couldn't breathe. Grace filmed it. Hyunki was too busy crying laughing to film anything. Seo-jun watched Loreen across the table. Full laugh, head back, eyes bright. Her hand on his mother's arm like they'd known each other for years, and felt something settle in his chest that had not been settled in a very long time. Later, walking to the car, the city quiet and cool, he took her hand without announcement. She let him. This is going to be interesting, she said, looking up at the Seoul skyline. It already is. Your mother is going to be in our business forever. Yes, I'm not actually complaining. I know. He glanced down at her. She already called you her daughter-in-law. Loreen stopped walking. In front of who? The restaurant owner. And I think she texted her church group. Loreen pressed her lips together. Failed to keep a straight face. She is so out of control. Completely. You love it. Completely, she agreed. He pulled her in by their joined hands and kissed her right there on the Mapo pavement. The Tae River wind doing its thing. The city lit up and indifferent and beautiful. She kissed him back with the energy of someone who had fought for her peace and intended to enjoy it. Somewhere across Seoul, Cha Yejin was in her first therapy appointment. Something her own best friend had quietly arranged, tired, finally, of watching someone she loved spiral. Somewhere in Uido, Jung Byung-go was writing a memo that would go nowhere. Somewhere in Hanamdong, Kwon Myri was texting Loreen a photo of a wedding venue with absolutely no context. Loreen read the text in the car, Seo-jun's hand on the gearshift, the city sliding past her window. She texted back, Myri, we've been together for 3 months. Myri? And Loreen stared at her phone, looked at Seo-jun, looked back at her phone. She typed, it's a nice venue. Myri replied with 7 heart emojis and what appeared to be a screenshot of a catering menu. Loreen put her phone face down on her thigh and said nothing. Seo-jun, who had not seen the exchange, glanced over. Everything okay? Your mother, Loreen said, is something else entirely. The very first thing I ever said about her, he confirmed. Loreen leaned her head back against the seat and watched Seoul go by. This city that had taken her in and tested her and handed her the most improbable, wonderful, absurd love story she'd never thought to plan for. She smiled at the roof of the car. Yeah. She was keeping him. 1 year later, the invitation was cream cardstock with gold foiling so clean it caught light like a mirror. Kwon Seo-jun and Loreen Adiz. Request the pleasure of your company. Myri had personally approved the font. She had also personally disapproved of the first 3 font options, the second venue, one of the flower arrangements, and the caterer's initial menu proposal. She had done all of this with such grace and specificity that nobody had felt managed. They had simply felt guided by a woman who knew exactly what excellence looked like and refused to settle below it. Loreen had watched her future mother-in-law dismantle and rebuild the wedding planning process from the ground up over 11 months and had felt, each time, an emotion somewhere between admiration and holy terror. She's incredible, Grace had said. At the 4th planning meeting she'd been dragged to as Loreen's emotional support human. She's a force of nature wearing Chanel, Loreen had replied. Same thing. The wedding was held in late October, 1 year and 17 days after the dinner at Yunha, at a private estate in Gapyeong, 2 hours outside Seoul, where the trees had gone gold and red and the kind of amber that made everything look like a memory while it was still happening. There were 112 guests. Every single one of them had been personally vetted by either Loreen or Myri, which meant the room was full of people who were genuinely happy to be there. A rarity at weddings, a miracle at weddings involving a Mafia family. Grace was maid of honor and cried through the entire ceremony while maintaining fierce eye contact with the officiant as though daring him to acknowledge it. Hyunki was a groomsman and had prepared a speech that Seo Jun had pre-read and approved, and that still somehow contained 3 jokes at Seojun's expense that landed perfectly. Nam Ji-hoon and Park Sun-woo stood at the back of the ceremony in suits that Loreen had selected, because she trusted no one else's taste, and both of them cried quietly and denied it afterward. Loreen walked herself down the aisle. It had been her decision, made quietly and without drama. Her father was in Lagos and had flown in. He was there, seated in the front row, resplendent in an agbada that made half the room do a double take. But she had told him she wanted to walk herself in. "I've been walking myself into rooms my whole life, Daddy. This one just has better lighting." He had laughed and said she was exactly like her mother and straightened her veil. She wore ivory, not white ivory. A gown with a structured bodice and a full skirt that moved like water. Her locks down and loose with small gold cuffs threaded through them at intervals, catching the October light. Her jewelry was her grandmother's, simple, gold, old. When she appeared at the end of the aisle, Seo Jun, who had been composed, still, and entirely in control for 31 years and approximately 4 minutes into this wedding, stopped being any of those things. His jaw didn't drop. He didn't make a sound. He simply looked at her and something in his face opened completely, like a room with all the windows thrown wide, and Ji-hoon, standing next to him, very quietly said, "Breathe, boss," which Seo Jun ignored. Myri, in the front row, watched her son watch Loreen and pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling and absolutely did not cry because she had done her makeup herself and it was a masterpiece and she was not sacrificing it. She lasted until Loreen reached the altar and smiled at Seo Jun with that specific smile. The unbothered, fully in charge ICU smile, and then Myri cried, completely, and fixed her makeup afterward in 90 seconds flat because she was Kwan Myri and she contained multitudes. The vows were written by both of them separately and read for the first time aloud at the altar. Seo Jun went first. He was not a man of many public words and everyone in the room knew it, which made the silence before he spoke feel like held breath. He said, "I have been in rooms full of dangerous people my whole life and I was never once afraid. You walked into a meeting room with a highlighter and structural drawings and I couldn't remember my own name. I don't think I've recovered. I don't want to." Grace made a sound. Loreen pressed her lips together very hard. He continued, "You taught me that protecting someone doesn't mean standing in front of them. Sometimes it means standing beside them and trusting that they've already handled it. I'm still learning that. I'll spend however long you'll give me learning it." Loreen took one careful breath. Then she read hers. "I came to Seoul for a fellowship and a career and I was not accepting applications for anything else. You were persistent without being pushy, which is a very specific skill, and I want you to know I noticed it and found it extremely annoying and also very effective." Laughter from the room. Seojun's mouth curved. "You are kind in the ways that count. The quiet ways, the 11 p.m. Jampong ways, the I listened to you mention something once 3 weeks ago ways. You make me feel like being known is safe. That's not a small thing. That's everything." A pause. "Also, your mother is the greatest woman alive and I need that on record." Myri, from the front row, said, out loud, at a wedding, into the microphone's ambient range, "I know." The room lost itself completely. At the reception, Loreen danced with her father to a song he'd sung to her as a child, and the room gave them space and silence for it. She danced with Grace to something loud and joyful that had half the guests on their feet. She danced with Myri, the two of them in the middle of the floor, gold and ivory, laughing at something nobody else could hear, completely in their own world. Seo Jun danced with his mother first. Then he found Loreen and they danced slowly to something that wasn't slow music. Because she said slow songs were too obvious and he had learned to find her logic impeccable. "Happy?" he said against her temple. "Extremely," she said. You have to ask? I like hearing it." "Happy," he said. "Extremely." Somewhere across the city, in a quieter version of her life, Cha Yejin was still into therapy and had recently taken a solo trip to Jeju that she'd posted about without mentioning anyone else. Her therapist said she was making real progress. She was starting to believe it. Her father had called Seo-jun once 6 months ago, brief and formal, something like an acknowledgement without being an apology. Seo-jun had accepted it for what it was. Loreen had said good enough and meant it. Some chapters closed cleanly. Some just stopped. Late that night, after the guests had gone and the estate was quiet, Loreen sat on the stone steps outside with her heels off and her gown pulled around her, looking at the dark Gapyeong hills. Seo-jun came out with 2 glasses of wine and sat beside her, jacket off, sleeves rolled. They sat without talking for a while, the kind of quiet that only existed between people who had earned it. Myri already texted me about grandchildren, Loreen said. How many times? 3. Since the reception ended. Seo-jun closed his eyes briefly. I apologize on behalf of. Don't. Loreen leaned her head on his shoulder. I texted her back. He looked down at her. What did you say? Loreen sipped her wine, looked at the hills, said nothing for a comfortable, devastating 4 seconds. I said one thing at a time, Myri. Seo-jun went very still. One thing at a time was not no. He looked at his wife, a word that still felt like stepping into a room and finding it larger than expected. And she was smiling at the hills with that expression, the unbothered fully in charge one, and he thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last. Seoul had no idea what it was hosting. He kissed her temple. She let him. The hills were quiet. The night was gold. They stayed on the steps a long time.
Hello besties, in this story we learned that the right person won't ask you to shrink, they'll make room for everything you are. Loreen never made herself smaller to be loved, not for a field that doubted her, not for a city that didn't know her, not for a woman who tried to intimidate her. She showed up fully, fought cleanly, and loved openly, and everything she deserved found its way to her because of it, not in spite of it. Besties, so Joy learned that real love isn't about shielding someone from every storm. It's about trusting that the person beside you can handle the rain and choosing to stand beside them anyway. And the mother-in-law reminds us that when you find someone worth fighting for, you fight with grace, with strategy, and if necessary, with the silk Hermes curve. Besties, the world will always have a agent, someone who uses power, fear, and history to keep you stuck. But the story never belonged to her. It belonged to the woman who walked in and bothered, did her work, loved fiercely, and let Saul figure out the rest. Show up fully, the red table was always yours. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like, subscribe, and share.